This is the full reading of the Grokipedia article on French Revolution. The French Revolution, 1789 to 1799, was a decade of radical political, social, and economic upheaval in France that overthrew the absolute monarchy of the Bourbon dynasty, abolished feudal privileges, and established the First Republic amid widespread violence and instability, triggered by a profound fiscal crisis exacerbated by decades of costly wars, including support for the American Revolution and inefficient taxation that left the crown unable to serve its massive debts. The Estates General was convened in May 1789, leading to the formation of the National Assembly and the symbolic storming of the Bastille on July 14th. Key legislation achievements, including the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen in August 1789, the nationalization of church property to fund the states via assignats, and the execution of King Louis XVI on January 21st, 1793, after his failed flights to Varennes and trial for treason. The revolution's radical phase, known as the Reign of Terror, September 1783 to July 1794, saw the Committee of Public Safety under Maximilien Robespierre orchestrate the guillotining of approximately 17,000 people, officially, with additional tens of thousands perishing from prison conditions, mass drownings in Nantes, or extrajudicial reprisals, primarily targeting perceived counter-revolutionaries but also internal rivals. While promoting Enlightenment's ideas of liberty, equality, and fraternity, the upheaval provoked civil wars in the Vendée region, where Republicans forces killed up to 250,000 civilians and ignited the French Revolutionary Wars against European monarchies, ultimately enabling General Napoleon Bonaparte's coup of 18 Brumaire in November 1799, which ended the Republican experiments and ushered in the Napoleonic era. Despite its aspirations for rational governance, the revolution demonstrated the perils of unchecked radicalism as factional purges and economic policies like price controls fueled inflation and shortages, undermining initial reforms and highlighting casual tensions between ideological fervor and practical statecraft. Background and causes: fiscal and economic pressures. France's fiscal woes in the decades preceding 1789 stemmed largely from war-related expenditures that outpaced revenue capacity. The Seven Years' War, 1756 to 1763, and French intervention in the American War of Independence, 1775 to 1783, imposed enormous costs, with the latter alone accounting for roughly 2 billion livres in direct and indirect outlays, including loans, military subsidies, and naval operations. These commitments elevated the public debt to approximately 4 billion livres in the mid-1780s, a figure that ballooned further amid ongoing borrowing to cover deficits. Annual interest on his debts absorbed about 50% of government expenditures by 1788, rendering routine operations unsustainable without new funds. The Ancien Régime's tax regime compounded these pressures through structural inefficiencies and exemptions that shielded the privileged orders. Direct taxes like the tithe fell disproportionately on the Third Estate, peasants, and bourgeoisie, while nobility and clergy evaded most direct levies, contributing less than 2% of their incomes in equivalents. Indirect taxes, such as the gabelle on salt, generated over 55 million livres yearly by the 1780s, but were regressive, evadable by the wealthy, and administered via costly private fermiers general who skimmed 10 to 25% in fees. Total royal revenues stabilized around 470 million livres annually in the late 1780s, yet expenditures routinely exceeded 600 million, yielding deficits like the 126 million livres shortfall in 1786, equivalent to 1/5 of the budget, and forcing reliance on short-term loans at escalating rates. Reform efforts by finance ministers underscored the political barriers to resolution. Jacques Necker, controller general from 1777 to 1781 and again in 1788, restored to opaque borrowing and published a sanitized compte rendu au roi in 1781 that understated the deficit to avoid alarming creditors, achieving temporary liquidity but deferring structural fixes. His successor, Charles-Alexandre de Calonne, 1783 to 1787, proposed a universal impôt territorial on land regardless of owner status and streamlined collection, but the Assembly of Notables rejected it in 1787, citing infringement on privileges and sparking Calonne's exile. Michel de Brienne interim measures collapsed by August 16, 1788, when the Treasury suspended redemption on 2/3 of loans, effectively signaling insolvency and prompting Louis XVI to summon the Estates General, the first time since 1614, to legitimize emergency taxation. These physical rigidities, rooted in absolute finance, unable to adapt without noble consent, directly catalyzed the revolutionary crisis. Social structure and inequalities. The social structure of pre-revolutionary France under the Ancien Régime was rigidly hierarchical, divided into 3 estates that determined legal status, privileges, and fiscal obligations. The first estate encompassed the Catholic clergy, numbering approximately 130,000 individuals, or 0.5% of the population, who owned about 10% of the land and collected tithes equivalent to about 10% of agricultural produce from peasants. The second estate included the nobility, comprising roughly 350,000 people, or 1.5% of the population, who held about 25% of the land and enjoyed extensive feudal rights over tenants, including labor services and exclusive access to high offices and military commissions. Together, these privileged orders constituted less than 2% of the populace, but controlled significant wealth and were largely exempt from direct taxation like the taille, shifting the burden to the third estate. The third estate, making up 98% of France's approximately 28 million inhabitants in 1789, included diverse groups from urban bourgeoisie and professional to rural peasants and urban laborers, yet collectively owned only about 65% of the land. The estates bore the brunt of taxation, paying the taille, a land tax, gabelle, salt tax, and corvée, forced labor, alongside feudal dues to lords and tithes to the church, which could consume up to half of the peasant's income in some regions. Social mobility was limited by letters de noblesse, purchases, or venal offices, but these were costly and did not erase underlying inequalities, as the bourgeoisie, despite commercial success, lacked political influence equal to their economic rise and resented noble privileges in the governance and judiciary roles. These disparities fueled widespread grievances articulated in the Cahiers de Doléances compiled in early 1789 by the Third Estate Assemblies, which demanded abolition of feudal privileges, equitable taxation without exemptions for clergy or nobility, and voting by head rather than by estates in representative bodies to reflect numerical majority. Rural peasants, comprising over 80% of the Third Estate, faced additional hardships from enclosure movement, reducing common lands, and periodic subsistence crises, exacerbating resentment towards seigneurs who enforced banalities, including inclusive use fees for mill and ovens. Urban workers, meanwhile, contended with guild restrictions and rising food prices, highlighting intra-estate inequalities that nonetheless unified the Third Estate against the privileged orders. Systematic advantages. This structure, rooted in the medieval origins and perpetrated by royal absolutism, created casual pressures from reform, as physical exigencies exposed the unsustainability of exempting productive elites from contributing to state revenues amid growing debts. Ideological ferments and Enlightenment critiques. The Enlightenment in 18th century France fostered a climate of intellectual scrutiny directed at the absolutist monarchy, aristocratic privileges, and ecclesiastic authority, challenging the traditional foundations of the Ancien Régime. Thinkers emphasized reason, natural rights, and empirical observation over divine rights and custom, arguing that political power derived from rational consent rather than hereditary entitlements. This ideological shift, while not uniformly revolutionary, eroded legitimacy for unchecked royal authority by portraying it as arbitrary and inefficient. Montesquieu's De l'Esprit des Lois, 1748, critiqued absolute monarchy by advocating separation of powers into legislative, executive, and judicial branches, drawing from the observations of England's post-1688 constitution to propose checks against despotism. Voltaire, through Essays and Lettres philosophiques, 1734, lambasted religious intolerance and the Catholic Church's alliance with the throne, promoting tolerance and limited government while exposing clerical corruption and monarchical overreach as barriers to progress. Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Du Contrat Social, 1762, further intensified critiques by posting that legitimate authority stemmed from a social contract embodying the general will of the people, decrying inequality and feudal privileges as artificial distortions of natural equality. These works, though often censored, circulated clandestinely and influenced educated elites by framing absolutism as incompatible with human reason and social unity. Ideas proliferated through Parisian salons, informal gatherings hosted by figures like Madame Geoffrin, where nobles, philosophers, and reformers debated reforms amid coffeehouse culture and Masonic lodges. The pamphlets and the Encyclopedia, 1751 to 1772, edited by Denis Diderot, amplified critiques by compiling rationalist knowledge that implicitly undermined scriptural and traditional justifications for hierarchy. Despite royal censorship, which banned or burned offending texts, underground printing and foreign publication ensured wide diffusion among the bourgeoisie and the lower clergy by the 1780s. In the immediate prelude to 1789, Abbé Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès synthesized these strands in Qu'est-ce que le tiers-état? January 1789, asserting that the Third Estate, comprising 98% of the population, constituted the nation's true essence, reduced to political nullity by privileged orders. Selling tens of thousands of copies rapidly, the pamphlet demanded the Third Estate's dominance in the Estates General, framing exclusion from power as a rational absurdity rather than divine order. Such writings crystallized Enlightenment skepticism into actionable grievances, priming delegates for confirmation with absolutist structures. Outbreak of Revolution, 1789. Convening the Estates General and National Assembly. France's severe financial crisis, exacerbated by debts from the American Revolutionary War, costly court expenditures, and failed tax reforms under controllers generals Charles Alexandre de Caillon and Loménie de Brienne, prompted King Louis XVI to summon the Estates General in 1788. After public unrest and the dismissal of Finance Minister Jacques Necker. The Estates General, last convened in 1614, consisted of representatives from the three estates. The first estate, the clergy; the second estate, nobility; then the third estate, the commoners. With the third estates granted double representation to reflect its population majority, but voting traditionally occurring by estate rather than by head. The assembly opens on May 5th, 1789, at Versailles, where delegates presented cahiers de doléances, lists of grievances, from their constituencies, but procedural disputes immediately arose as the Third Estate demanded the verification of the credentials jointly and voting by head to achieve meaningful reform. By mid-June, the Third Estate's delegates, frustrated by delays and exclusions from joint sessions, unilaterally verified their own credentials and on June 17, 1789, declared themselves the National Assembly, asserting sovereignty to represent the entire nation and draft a constitution. On June 20th, after royal officials locked the meeting hall for the royal session, the deputies relocated to a nearby tennis court, Jeu de Paume, and swore the tennis court oath, pledging not to disband until France had written constitution establishing regular legislative meetings. This act of defiance transformed the Estates General deadlock into a revolutionary assertion of popular sovereignty, drawing support from reform-minded lower clergy and some nobles, while Louis XVI's attempt to dissolve the assembly via troops only heightened tensions. By June 27th, the king ordered the First and Second Estates to join the National Assemblies, effectively recognizing its legitimacy amid growing public sympathy in Paris and the provinces. Storming of the Bastille and the Great Fear. The storming of the Bastille took place on July 14, 1789, amid escalating tensions in Paris following King Louis XVI's dismissal of the popular finance minister Jacques Necker on July 11th, which Parisians interpreted as a prelude to royal repression backed by troops amassed around the city. Crowds had already raided the Hôtel des Invalides on July 13 for approximately 32,000 muskets, but sought gunpowder stored in the Bastille, a royal fortress symbolizing arbitrary imprisonment despite holding only 7 prisoners at the time: 4 forgers, 2 individuals deemed mentally ill, and 1 aristocrat detained for moral offenses. The attackers, numbering in the hundreds, including mutinous French guards, bombarded the fortress with cannon fire after failed negotiations. The governor, Bernard René de Launaye, surrendered around 5:30 p.m., but was beaten by death by the mob, decapitated, and his head paraded on a spike through the Paris streets. Approximately 100 attackers were killed in the assault, with the event yielding limited practical arms but galvanizing revolutionary sentiments as a direct challenge to royal authority. In the countryside, the Great Fear erupted concurrently from late July into early August 1789, manifesting as a wave of peasants' panics and localized revolts triggered by rumors of brigands, often vagrants or unemployed, allegedly hired by aristocrats and royalists to plunder villages and crush the emerging revolution. Originating around July 19 to 20 in regions like Franche-Comté and spreading westward through chains of hearsay and fear. These panics prompted armed peasants to target manor houses, chateaus, and symbols of feudalism, destroying tax records, charters, and other documents enforcing seigneurial dues rather than engaging in widespread violence against persons. The unrest affecting much of rural France by August 6 reflected deep-seated grievances over feudal obligations exacerbated by harvest anxieties and news of urban upheaval, but subsided as local militias quelled disordered and the National Assembly responded with reforms. This rural mobilization pressured the Assembly to abolish feudal privileges on the night of August 4, 1789, marking a pivotal step towards dismantling the old regime's economic structures. Initial reforms, abolition of feudalism, and declaration of rights. In the wake of the storming of the Bastille on July 14, 1789, and the ensuing Great Fear, a wave of peasant uprising against the manorial lords that spread across rural France from late July, the National Constituent Assembly sought to address deep-seated grievances to restore order. These events pressured deputies, particularly liberal nobles, to confront feudal systems remnants, including seigneurial dues, hunting monopolies, and ecclesiastic tithes that burdened the Third Estates. The pivotal session occurred during the nights of August 4th through 5th, 1789, when Viscount de Noailles, followed by Ducomte d'Aiguillon, and other progressive aristocrats proposed renouncing feudal privileges in a bid to appease the peasantry and unify the nation. In a fervent atmosphere lasting until dawn, the assembly unanimously abolished the feudal regime entirely, extinguishing rights tied to real or personal property without compensation, while mandating redemption with interests for redeemable dues like banalité and sens. This included ending exclusive noble hunting rights, internal customs barriers with provinces, and the sale of judicial offices, though venality of offices persisted temporarily pending buyouts. The decrees, formalized as 19 articles on August 11, 1789, marked a symbolic rupture from the old regime, but retained economic safeguards for landlords, reflecting pragmatic limits amid revolutionary fever rather than pure egalitarianism. Building on this momentum, the Assembly shifted to codifying fundamental principles, forming a committee led by figures like the Abbaye de Sieyès to draft a Declaration of Rights, influenced by Enlightenment thinkers such as Rousseau and Montesquieu, as well as the Virginia Declaration of Rights. The resulting Déclaration des droits de l'homme et du citoyen was approved on August 26, 1789, comprising a preamble and 17 articles. It asserted that men are born and remain free and equal in rights, with social distinctions justified only by public utility, and vested sovereignty exclusively in the nation rather than the king or states. Core tenets included liberty as the right to do anything, not harming others, inviolable property rights, freedom of opinion and press, the resistance to oppression as a duty when governments violated rights. The Declaration emphasized law as the expression of the general will, applicable equally to all citizens, and prohibited arbitrary arrest or punishment without legal process. While proclaiming universal natural rights, it implicitly deferred full equality by later enabling distinctions between active citizens, propertied males eligible to vote, and passive ones, preserving fiscal hierarchies amid the Assembly's reformist conservatism. Intended as the constitutional preamble, it galvanized revolutionary ideology but faced criticism from conservatives for undermining monarchical authority and from radicals for insufficiently eradicating privilege. These reforms, enacted within weeks of the Bastille's fall, dismantled feudal legal structures and ensured rights-based governance, yet their implementation revealed tensions between rhetorical universality and practical concessions to property interests. Constitutional monarchy phase, 1789 to 1792. Development of the 1791 Constitution. The National Constituent Assembly, established on June 17, 1789, after the Tennis Court Oath of July 20th, identified drafting a constitution as its central task to replace absolute monarchy with a structured government limited by laws. On July 6, 1789, the Assembly appointed a preliminary committee of 30 members to outline an initial draft, which was completed in August but deferred amid pressing reforms like feudal abolition and church reorganization. In February 1790, a specialized 9-member constitutional committee assumed responsibility, comprising influential figures including Charles Maurice and Talleyrand Bérigord, Bishop of Autun, Isaac Le Chapelier, Jean-Joseph Mounier, and the Marquis de Lafayette. This group delivered a substantive draft by May 1790, emphasizing separation of powers, civil rights, and administrative decentralization. Progress stalled due to debates over royal authority, electoral qualifications, and provincial governance, prompting frequent revisions through 1790. By January 1791, an 11-member committee of revisions, including Talleyrand, Le Chapelier, Lafayette, and Adrien Duport, refined the document into a comprehensive proposal exceeding 300 articles, organized into sections on rights, public powers, and local administration. Presented in March 1791, it underwent the Righteous Assembly's scrutiny. Amendments addressed concerns over legislative supremacy and monarchical veto powers, culminating in Assembly approval on June 3, 1791. King Louis XVI initially withheld sanction, citing insufficient executive prerogatives, but the flights to Varennes from June 20th to 25th, 1791, where his attempted escape led to capture and return under guard, eroded his leverage, compelling acceptance under distress. The Assembly formally adopted the Constitution on September 3, 1791, with Louis XVI ratifying it and swearing an oath to uphold it on September 14, 1791, thereby inaugurating France's first written constitution and transitioning into a constitutional monarchy. The drafting process reflected tensions between monarchists, moderates seeking to preserve royal influence, and reformers advocating popular sovereignty, shaped by Enlightenment principles yet constrained by fiscal crisis and rural unrest demanding practical stability over radical overhaul. Electoral laws restricted active citizenship to propertied males over 25 paying direct taxes equivalent to 3 days' labor wage, excluding women, servants, and the indigent from voting, thus balancing revolutionary ideals with elite control. Factionalism in the Legislative Assembly. The Legislative Assembly, which convened on October 1, 1791, and sat until September 20, 1792, comprised 745 deputies elected indirectly by approximately 4.3 million active male citizens, those paying direct taxes equivalent to 3 days' labor wages under the provisions of the Constitution of 1791. This body inherited the unicameral structure from the National Constituent Assembly, but operated under a constitutional monarchy, with the king possessing suspensive veto power and the assembly responsible for legislation, taxation, and war declarations. Factionalism profoundly undermined its functionality, as deputies divided into ideological opposed groups reflecting border societal tensions over the pace of reform, the monarchy's role, and responses to counter-revolutionary threats, resulting in legislative gridlock and heightened radical pressures from Parisiens sans-culottes. The Feuillants, numbering roughly 165 deputies and occupying the right side of the chamber, emerged as the conservative faction committed to upholding the 1791 Constitution and preserving a limited monarchy. Formed in July 1791, when moderate Jacobins, including leaders Antoine Barnave, Andrien Duport, and Alexandre de la Mont splits from the parent Jacobin club following Louis XVI's flight to Varennes. The Feuillants prioritized political stability, economic liberalization, and reconciliation with the crown to avert further upheaval. They opposed aggressive measures against émigrés and non-juring clergy, viewing such actions as provocative to domestic order and international relations, and resisted calls for war or republicanism, which they saw as destabilizing the fragile constitutional order. Their influence waned as they faced vilification from radicals for perceived royalist sympathies, particularly after the king's vetoes aligned with their preferences, leading to their marginalization by the mid 1792. Opposing the Feuillants on the left were approximately 330 Jacobin-affiliated deputies who advocated Republican ideals, expanded civil equality, and confrontational policies towards perceived enemies of the revolution. This bloc encompassed the pro-war Brissotins, led by Jacques-Pierre Brissot de Warville, who argued that military conflict with Austria and Prussia would expose internal traitors, purify revolutionary ranks, and foster national unity. Brissot's faction successively pressed for war declaration on April 20th, 1792, despite initial military setback that intensified domestic divisions. A more radical subgroup aligned with figures like Maximilien Robespierre and Georges Danton initially resisted Brissot's war advocacy, Robespierre warning in early 1792 that it risked dictatorship or monarchical resurgence, but increasingly demanded purges of suspect elements, including non-juring priests and émigré nobles, to safeguard the revolution's gains. These internal Jacobin tensions foreshadowed later Girondin Montagnard schisms, as Brissotins favored provincial bourgeois interests, were radicals drew support from urban popular socialists. The remaining 250 deputies formed the Plain, or Marais, a centralist mass of independents who lacked strong club affiliations and often aligned pragmatically with whatever faction held sway, prioritizing administrative efficiency over ideological purity. This group provided a buffer but contributed to paralysis, as shifting majorities stalled decisive action on critical issues like the civil constitution of the clergy's enforcement, where Louis XVI's veto on November 8th and 29th, 1791 against decrees deporting non-juring priests and confiscating émigré property blocked reforms favored by the left. Factional rivalries exacerbated by the king's perceived obscurantism and early war failures eroded confidence in the constitutional framework, culminating in petitions from 48 Paris sections and the sans-culottes mobilization, which pressured the assembly towards radical concessions and set the stage for the monarchy's overthrow on August 10th, 1792. Flight to Varennes and erosion of monarchical authority. On the nights of 21 June 1791, King Louis XVI his wife Marie Antoinette, their 2 children, and the king's sister Elizabeth departed Paris from the Tuileries Palace in a large Berlin carriage disguised to evade revolutionary surveillance. The escape, meticulously planned by Swedish Count Alex von Fersen, with military coordination from General François Claude Amour, Marquis de Bouillé, aimed to reach the fortress of Montmédy near the Austrian border, approximately 200 miles away, where loyal troops could provide protection and enable the king to either rally support against the National Assembly or seek foreign aid. The journey encountered multiple delays that doomed the effort. A late start after midnight on June 20th due to last-minute preparations, getting lost in Paris streets, a broken carriage harness requiring repairs, and missing scheduled relays of escort soldiers at Pont de Somme-Vesle and Saint-Ménéhould. At Saint-Ménéhould, the royal party was recognized by local postmaster Jean-Baptiste Drouet, who compared Louis XVI's features to those on a 50 livres assignats banknotes portrait and alerted authorities via horse relay. Pursued and intercepted at Varennes en Argonne around 11 p.m. on 21st June, the family was detained by local National Guard under Mayor Jean-Baptiste Sauce, who refused Bouillé's arriving hussars entry without orders from the National Assembly. Returned to Paris under heavy guard by 25th of June, the royals were reinstalled in the Tuileries but subjected to intensified restrictions, including around-the-clock surveillance by National Guard forces recommended by the Marquis de Lafayette. Louis XVI publicly justified the flight as a temporary absence to assure his freedom and religious observance. But the incident exposed his unwillingness to accept revolutionary constraints, shattering illusions of his commitment to constitutional monarchy. The flight to Varennes marked a pivotal erosion of monarchical authority, transforming public perception from reluctant reformer to outright traitor intent on subverting the revolution. Mass demonstrations ensued, with over 6,000 Parisians petitioning the National Assembly on 17th July 1791 at the Champ de Mars for the king's despotism and a republic, resulting in the massacre of approximately 50 protesters by National Guard troops. Moderate supporters of the 1791 Constitution, including Lafayette and Bailly, lost credibility for having vouched for the king's loyalty, with radical factions like the Cordelier Club and Jacobin gained momentum, accelerating demands for republican governance. This breach fueled suspicion of foreign intrigue, hastening the revolution's radical turn and the eventual overthrow of the monarchy in August 1792. Radical turn and First Republic, 1792 to 1793. Overthrow of the monarchy and establishment of the Republic. The overthrow of the French monarchy accelerated amid military setbacks in the war against Austria and Prussia, declared on 20th of April 1792, and exacerbated by the Brunswick Manifesto issued on the 25th of July 1792 by the Duke of Brunswick, commander of Prussian forces. The manifesto demanded the restoration of Louis XVI's authority and threatened Paris with total ruin if the royal family was harmed, but instead it radicalized Parisian radicals with portraying foreign powers and as intent on crushing the revolution. This fueled demands for the king's disposition, with sections of the Paris petitioning the Legislative Assembly to suspend the monarchy and convene a national convention. On the 10th of August, 1792, an insurrection erupted with approximately 20,000 sans-culottes, supported by fédérés from Marseille and Brittany, and elements of the National Guard under defecting commander Santerre stormed the Tuileries Palace where Louis XVI resided. The Swiss Guard, numbering about 900, defended the palace but was overwhelmed. Around 600 were killed, many after surrendering, while the king and royal family fled to the Legislative Assembly for safety. The assembly, facing the fait accompli, suspended the king, imprisoned the royal family and in the temple prison, dissolved the monarchy's remaining powers, and called for elections to a national convention based on universal male suffrage to draft a new constitution. Elections for the National Convention occurred from late August to early September 1782, producing an assembly of roughly 750 deputies, predominantly new faces aligned with Republican ideals rather than the prior Girondin or monarchist factions. The convention convened on the 20th of September 1792, coinciding with the Battle of Valmy. The same day were French forces under General Kellerman and Dumouriez repelled a Prussian advance with artillery fire, preventing an immediate threat to Paris despite minimal infantry engagement. This standoff victory, costing fewer than 100 French casualties, halted the coalition's momentum and emboldened the revolutionaries. On the 21st of September 1792, the convention formally abolished the monarchy by acclamation, declaring France a republic the following day, retroactively dated to the autumn equinox as Year 1 of Liberty. This establishment of the First Republic marked the end of over a millennium of monarchical rule, driven by fears of counter-revolution amid invasion and internal unrest, though it immediately deepened factional divides between Montagnard and Girondin over governance and the king's fate. Trial, execution of Louis XVI, and Girondin-Montagnard split. The National Convention, elected in September 1792 following the overthrow of the monarchy on August 10th, initiated proceedings against Louis XVI on December 3rd by voting to try him for treason. On December 11th, the former king, now designated as citizen Louis Capet, appeared before the convention, where he was indicted on charges including high treason and conspiracy against the state's safety, supported by documents from the Armoire de Fer, iron chest, discovered in the Tuileries Palace, revealing correspondence with foreign powers. The indictment encompassed 33 specific crimes, such as collusion with invading Austrian and Prussian forces during the ongoing war and sabotage of revolutionary efforts. During the trial from December 1792 to January 1793, Louis XVI was denied full legal counsel and the right to present a robust defense, with the convention serving as prosecutor, judge, and jury. Debate centered on three key questions: Louis' guilt, whether to appeal the verdict to the people via primary assemblies, and the appropriate punishments. Montagnard deputies, seated on the assembly's high left branches and favoring radical measures, united in demanding conviction and execution with a popular appeal, viewing the king as an existential threat to the republic. Girondin moderates, representing provisional interests and wary of unchecked central power, were divided. Many advocated on an appeal to the sovereign people to legitimize the outcome, exposing them to accusations of royalist sympathies. Voting occurred January 5th through 17th, 15th through 17th, 1793. Guilt was affirmed by a near unanimous tally. Louis's objections were dismissed. The appeal rejected 424 to 283, and death penalty approved 387, 334, with 46 proposing alternatives like banishment or imprisonment. On January 21st, 1793, Louis XVI was executed by guillotine at the Place de la Révolution, now Place de la Concorde, before a large crowd. As he ascended the scaffold, he declared, "I die innocent of all the crimes laid to my charge. I pardon those who have occasioned my death, and I pray to God that the blood you are going to spill will never fall upon France." Though variants report him stating, "Frenchman, I die innocent. It is from the scaffold that I tell you so." The executioner, Charles-Henri Sanson, severed the king's head with a single stroke, after which Sanson lifted it to the crowd, promoting the cries of "Vive la République." The event justified by Montagnard was as necessary to prevent counter-revolution, but criticized even then for its procedural irregularities, marked with irreversible radicalization of the revolution. The trial intensified the Girondin-Montagnard schism, rooted in ideological differences over centralization, war policy, and revolutionary purity, but exacerbated by personal rivalries and ambitions among leaders like Robespierre and Brizot. Girondins' hesitation on regicide, many voting against immediate execution, fueled Montagnard's claims of their complicity with monarchism, while Montagnard's insistency on swift justice highlighted their commitment to popular sovereignty via the Convention over Diffuse Assemblies. This fracture, evidenced in voting splits, culminated in the Montagnard's purge of Girondin deputies on June 2, 1793, following insurrections in Paris and Vendée, consolidating radical control, but sowing seeds of further internal purges. The split reflected casual tensions between Federalist moderation and Jacobin centralization, with empirical outcomes showing Montagnard dominance, enabling policies like the Terror, though at the cost of alienating provincial support. Outbreak of revolutionary wars with Europe. Tensions escalated after the failure of Louis XVI's flight to Varennes in June 1791, promoting European monarchs to issue warnings against further revolutionary encroachments. On August 27, 1791, the Declaration of Pillnitz, jointly signed by Austrian Emperor Leopold II and King Frederick William II of Prussia, affirmed their readiness to intervene militarily to restore the French monarchy if joined by other powers, citing the protection of Louis XVI and the containment of revolutionary instability. This statement, though conditional and not an immediate call to arms, heightened French fears of foreign invasion, and was leveraged by pro-war factions to justify preemptive action. Within France, the Legislative Assembly convened in October 1791, became a battleground for war advocates, primarily the Girondins led by Jacques-Pierre Brissot. Brissot argued that war would unify the nation, expose internal traitors, resolve economic stagnation through conquest, and propagate revolutionary principles abroad as a cause of liberty, while also testing the king's loyalty. Girondin influence grew, culminating in decrees against émigrés in November 1791 and non-juring priests, which provoked Austria by demanding the dispersal of royalist exiles gathered near the border. Louis XVI, suspecting the Girondins' Republican leanings, reluctantly assented to their war policy, privately anticipating defeat would invite foreign forces to bolster his authority. On April 20th, 1792, the Legislative Assembly declared war on Austria, specifically targeting Francis II as King of Hungary and Bohemia, framing it as a defensive measure against monarchical threats, but rooted in revolutionary expansionism. Initial French offenses into the Austrian Netherlands faltered due to poorly organized armies, plagued by desertions and aristocratic officer émigrés, resulting in defeats at Kievan and other border clashes in late April and May. Prussia allied with Austria in June, and under the Duke of Brunswick, coalition forces invaded France in July, capturing Longwy on August 23rd and Verdun on September 2nd, while the Brunswick Manifesto threatened exemplary punishment for revolutionaries if the royal family was endangered. The turning point came at the Battle of Valmy on September 20th, 1792, where approximately 36,000 French troops under General Charles-François Dumouriez and François-Christophe de Kellerman repelled the Prussian advance of similar size, though sustained artillery fire despite minimal infantry engagement. Heavy rain supply shortages and low morale compelled the Prussians to withdraw, marking the first major French success and preventing an assault on Paris. This outcome stabilized the revolution, enabling the National Convention's proclamation of the First Republic on September 22nd and shifting the conflict towards French offensives. Reign of Terror, 1793 to 1794. Formation of the Committee of Public Safety. The Committee of Public Safety was established on April 6, 1793 by decree of the National Convention amid escalating crises threatening the young republic, including military setbacks and defection of General Charles-François Dumouriez to Austrian forces the previous day. Widespread counter-revolutionary rebellions such as the Vendée Uprising and federalist revolts in provinces like Lyon and Marseille. The decree created a 9-member body elected by the convention and renewable 1-month term, intended to centralize authority over war efforts, diplomacy, and internal security, functioning as a facto executive to supersede fragmented prior committees. Initial membership included prominent figures such as Georges Danton, who played a key role in its conception and early dominance, Bertrand Barrère de Vieuzac, tasked with reporting to the convention, Joseph Cambon, handling finances, Robert Lindet, overseeing judicial matters. Other early members comprised Jean-François Bertrand Delmas, Jean-Antoine de Brie, and Jean Debray, reflecting a mix of Montagnard influences, but initially moderated by Danton's pragmatic approach, favoring negotiation over immediate radical purges. The committee's formation responded to the Republic's dire strategic position, with French armies in retreat from coalition forces and domestic disorder, undermining mobilization, necessitating unified commands to avert collapse. From April to early July 1793, the committee operated under Danton's leadership, prioritizing military reorganization and tentative overtures to pacify internal dissenters. Though its limited initial powers renewed monthly without broad enforcement mechanisms, it constrained decisive action against entrenched threats. This phase marked a shift towards emergency governance, as the conventions delegated oversight of generals, provising and surveillance to the body, setting precedents for its later expansion into a more absolutist instruments. By July 10, 1793, following the purge of Girondin deputies and intensified pressures, the committee was restricted with 12 permanent members and extraordinary powers, including the ability to act without convention approval in crisis, solidifying its role in the escalating reign of terror. Dechristianization, economic control, and maximum policies. The dechristianization campaign during the Reign of Terror, peaking from September 1793 to July 1794, aimed to dismantle the Catholic Church's institutional and cultural dominance through aggressive and secularization efforts led by Herbatist radicals and local revolutionary committees. Measures included the closure of thousands of churches, over 2,000 in Paris alone, by early 1794, forced laicization of clergy, destruction of crosses, statues, and altars, and the imposition of a republican calendar abolishing Christian holidays. Jacques Herbert, prosecutor of the French Commune, and Pierre Gaspard Chaumet orchestrated public spectacles such as the Festival of Reason on November 10, 1793, Van Brumaire Year 2, where Notre Dame Cathedral was repurposed for an atheistic rite featuring an actress enthroned as the golden goddess of reason amid revolutionary hymns and liberation to liberty. These actions, justified as combating fanaticism and priestly counter-revolution, resulted in the execution or exile of thousands of refractory priests and fueled rural revolts, notably exacerbating the Vendée Civil War, where religious grievances mobilized tens of thousands against Republican forces. Opposition within the revolutionary leadership emerged by early 1794, as Maximilien Robespierre viewed Herbertist atheism as socially destabilizing and morally coercive, prompting his denunciation of dechristianization excesses in December 1793 and promoting of the deistic cult of the Supreme Being via decree on May 7, 1794. 18 Floréal, Year 2. The campaign's intensity waned after the Herbatist execution on March 24, 1784, 4 Germinal, Year 2, though sporadic violence persisted until the Thermidorian reaction curtailed it entirely. Overall, dechristianization eroded traditional social cohesion without establishing a viable civic religion, contributing to the reign of terror's ideological fractures and alienated conservative elements essential for national unity and amid war. Parallel to cultural upheavals, the Committee of Public Safety imposed stringent economic controls to combat hyperinflation from assignats over insurance. Currency value had plummeted over 90% since 1790, and wartime grain storages that left urban population on the brink of famine by mid-1793. Initial requisitions and embargoes on grain exports proved insufficient, leading to the decree of September 11, 1793, 25 Fruxidor Year 1, which mixed maximum prices for foodstuffs, followed by the comprehensive law of the general maximum on September 29, 1793, 7 Vendéminaire Year 2, capping prices for all first necessities at 1790 to 1791, levels plus one-third for circulation costs and risks, with wages similarly regulated in Paris and key departments. Violations included the hoarding or speculation, carried penalties up to death by guillotine, enforced through surveillance committees, military seizures, and public denunciations that integrated economic policing into the terror's representative apparatus. These maximum policies, while temporarily stabilizing urban bread supplies, Paris rations, held at £2 per person daily through early 1794, de-incentivized agricultural production as peasants, facing fixed low prices amid rising input costs and risks from conscription, withheld harvests or diverted them back to black markets where goods fetch double or triple official rates. Rural-urban tensions escalated, with forced requisitions sparking riots in provinces like Loire and Provence, and high overall grain outputs declined as farmers prioritized subsistence over market sales, exacerbating scarcities that persisted despite draconian enforcement claiming thousands of arrests. By spring 1794, the system's failures, evident in persistent inflation and empty markets, undermined popular support for the committee, foreshadowing policies reversal post-Thermidor, including partial wage deregulation by August 1794. The maximum cause flaws lay in overriding price signals that coordinate supply and demand, instead fostering invasion, corruption among officers, and a shadowy economy that evaded revolutionary control. Class repressions, tribunals, and death toll estimates. The law of suspects, enacted on September 17, 1793, formalized widespread arrests by authorizing the detention of individuals deemed enemies of the revolution, including former nobles, émigrés, priests refusing the civil constitution of the clergy, and anyone exhibiting suspicious behavior or associations. This decree targeted unsubmissive elites and perceived counter-revolutionaries, resulting in at least 300,000 arrests across France during the Terror, with surveillance committees empowered to act on vague criteria like corruption or fanaticism. Such representations extended beyond formal trials, encompassing massacres like the Noyade drownings in Nantes, where thousands were loaded into barges and submerged in the Loire River under local revolutionary authorities. The Revolutionary Tribunal, initially established in March 1793 to prosecute counter-revolutionary activities, became the central instrument of judicial terror. trying cases of alleged treason with procedures that prioritize speed and conviction over due process. Composed of a jury and public prosecutor Antoine Fouquier-Tinville, the tribunal handled high-profile cases condemning figures such as Marie Antoinette, executed on October 16, 1793, and Georges Danton, April 5, 1794, on charges of conspiracy, often based on coerced testimony or fabricated evidence. Defendants initially had rights to counsel and witness, but these were curtailed as the terror intensified. The law of 22 Prairial, promulgated on June 10, 1794, drastically accelerated proceedings by eliminating defense advocates, mandatory witnesses, and appeals, while expanding punishable offenses to include any act tending to favor the enemies of the revolution. This measure, pushed by Maximilien Robespierre, ushered in the Great Terror, with executions in Paris rising from an average of 3 per day before June to over 50 daily thereafter, as the tribunal operated under the presumption of guilt for those accused. Trials lasted minutes, relying on denunciations rather than substantive proof, leading to the rapid dispatch of nobles, clergy, and even fellow revolutionaries suspected of moderation. Death tolls estimated for the Reign of Terror vary due to incomplete records and differing inclusions of regional massacres, prison deaths, and Civil War casualties, but empirical counts indicate that approximately 16,600 official guillotine executions nationwide from June 1793 to July 1794, including 2,600 in Paris. Adding non-judicial killings such as 10,000 to 12,000 deaths in prison from neglect or summary executions like atrocities like the Vendée suppression, estimated 100,000 to 250,000 total war deaths, though not all directly terror related, yields a border toll exceeding 40,000 direct victims of state repression. These figures, derived from archival sentencing records and contemporary accounts, underscore the terror's skill as a deliberate policy of elimination rather than incidental violence, with historians noting the committee's orchestration to consolidate power amid external threats.